Hello and welcome back to the sign-up sessions, where this week we're going to go right back to the start. So Azure Synapse Analytics came into public preview fairly recently, and I got super excited and dove straight into the Spark side, the SQL on Demand side, rummaging around all the goodies that we've not really been able to see before. Now, over the weekend, a few people got in touch and said, all this sounds good, but what is it? And I'm using Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Isn't this just that with a different name? Where did Spark come from? So this time we're going to have a quick run through the beginning, what it is, where it came from, how to put it in the right context, what's live and what's not live. So less tech today, more just context, and if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. I'm new to YouTube. I keep forgetting to tell people that, but if you do, I'd appreciate it. So let's dig in. Okay, now in true consultant fashion, I have some slides. I just want to tell you the story, where it came from. So back in the day, we had the granddaddy, known as Parallel Data Warehouse, that then got rebranded as the Analytics Platform System, which is a whole mouthful. Now this thing was an appliance. So you had to buy the actual physical server with a specialist version of SQL Server that sat on top of it. And this thing worked as an MPP solution. That's massively parallel processing. Essentially, a whole load of SQL servers all stuck together, working in unison, spreading the work out, and then giving a single answer at the end. It's parallel scaling, but SQL style. So that was the analytics platform system, and it was quite big and very expensive. So a few people used it, not that many people used it. The people who used it loved it. Now, when people started using the cloud more and more and more and more, they said, well, that would be a great thing, right? Because rather than having this one fixed server that can't change, we can just go, well, actually, spread the work out across more servers, less servers. It is the perfect story for things like Azure. So we had that come along in the form of Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Now that took a lot of the good ideas, the good thinking, the core SQL engine from PDW, the Parallel Data Warehouse, and rebranded it and changed how it works. And it is different. Because obviously now we're talking about scalable amounts of compute, where that wasn't a concept back in the APS PDW days. And that's been in Azure for an age. So a lot of people are already using it. It's live. Lots of people love it. SQL Data Warehouse is a thing. It is good. It is useful. It's fairly mature and stable now. So last November, there was a big fanfare, announcements. We had, was it Ignite? And there was like big announcements saying, hey, it's now Azure Synapse Analytics. That's just a simple, straight rebranding. Ta-da! Announcing the new thing. We've taken Azure SQL Data Warehouse, we've changed the name, we've changed the logo. It's now called Azure Synapse Analytics. So all the docs, everything changed, except the actual product. It's the same thing, it's just Azure SQL Data Warehouse with another name. The confusing part is it's part of an evolution. So there's a new, bigger thing coming called Azure Synapse Analytics. That's right. The new big crazy thing is called the same thing as the thing that's currently live, and they wonder why people are getting confused with the marketing. So we've got these two concepts of Azure Synapse Analytics brackets SQL Data Warehouse, and then the new thing, the thing that's just in preview, is Azure Synapse Analytics Workspaces. And that's so much more than just the data warehouse part. So Synapse Analytics brackets SQL Data Warehouse is still present in the new big altogether thing, but it's now called Provision SQL Pools. Get that as a name evolution, right? We've gone PDW, we knew what that was. Azure SQL Data Warehouse, okay, it's strange that you name the product after what it's meant to be used for, but not all the use cases, but cool. Azure Synapse Analytics, okay, yeah, fine, just a rebranding. Azure Synapse Analytics, a bigger thing. Oh, and this thing's still part of it, but now it's a different thing. Super, super confusing, and I get why people don't know what's going on. So Azure Synapse Analytics, the SQL Data Warehouse version, is currently live. It's GA, so generally available, meaning use it in production. It's supported. It's a full-blown SLA-covered member of Azure. Azure Synapse Analytics Workspaces with other things in there is currently in public preview. So don't use it for production things. They're still building it. It's still buggy. They're still building up the story. That just doesn't quite explain what's in this big new thing and why you should care. So There's another slide, the marketing slide. This is the slide that every consultant under the sun just went, hey, this is what it's going to be, and pushed out, including advancing analytics. We were like, this is a new thing. Look at all those boxes. That sounds great. And that doesn't really tell the full story. So some great things. So down the side, we've got management, security, monitoring, Metastore. Having those all in one box, where previously they were managed in different places, that's great. Makes sense. The core confusing bit is all of those different languages. So I've got SQL, Python, .NET, Java, Scala, and R. And then I've got two different flavors. So do I want it provisioned or on demand? And that kind of looks like that's just all a single story, but it's not. So SQL, I can use provisioned or on demand. The Spark side of things, when we're talking about Python, .NET, Java, Scala, R, they don't work on demand. They are just provisioned. And that's not that clear from this diagram. So this is kind of just, it doesn't quite tell you how those things fit together. You have two different compute runtimes, one that's SQL-based and one that's Spark-based, which is why you have that different functionality. And yeah, that's kind of what we've had to go on. So I've had a stab. I pulled it back and said, let's just really simplify it, and let's talk about what is actually under the hood in this thing. So, super easy. We have 4 boxes. First, we'll talk about the compute options. What are these different versions of SQL, and then demand, and then not on demand, and all of that? Orchestration, how do we get things working, what's it based on, storage, and then what else is in the workspace. Let's see if this makes a bit more sense than that one diagram. So, options for compute. I've got 2 things on the SQL side. I've got provision SQL pools. Now that's when I want to say I know how many compute nodes I need. I want to have a certain number of SQL servers in my cluster doing some parallel work. I want to provision in advance. So I want to say, okay, turn my server on, and I expect I'll get some queries coming at some point. And I get charged by the hour, and I size it in data warehouse units. And if that's all sounding familiar, it's because that is exactly Azure SQL Data Warehouse. That rebranded badge of Synapse Analytics that used to be SQL Data Warehouse is now inside the Synapse Analytics workspace, now called Provision SQL Pools. And they are exactly the same thing. That is, Provision SQL Pools are SQL Data Warehouse built into this larger workspace. So that should be super familiar if you're from there. Now, on-demand SQL Pools is something else entirely. So that is a serverless version. That is I write a query, I hit go, and it instantly runs, and it doesn't actually run on any server. I don't have to scale it. I don't have to say how big it should be. I don't have to predict workload in advance. So, great. I get charged per terabyte read. So if I use that a hell of a lot, and I'm constantly hammering my leg, reading lots of data, that's going to cost me more than provisioning my SQL Data Warehouse. But it's a balancing act, so it depends on how much I use it and what I do. But if I don't know yet, and if I've got really, really unpredictable workloads, then I can just use on-demand SQL pools really quickly to try and figure things out, to get things going, and go from there. That's great. On the other side, I've got my Spark element. So I've got the provisioned Spark pools. I don't have on-demand Spark pools. Again, we couldn't quite see that from that last diagram. So I can choose a Spark cluster. So I can say I would like a cluster with this many nodes, they should be this big, this balance between memory and compute, all of that kind of thing. And I can run some queries. And that query can be Python or R or SQL, C#. It can be Spark SQL, it can be Scala. I've got lots of different flavors because it's Spark. The one weird one, the C# one in there, is kind of cool. That is the first time we've had a Spark engine where C# is a native language, which is great. Now, it's got to be said, that is not Databricks. And that's another thing that caused a load of confusion. Everyone's like, but we've got Spark in Azure, it's called Databricks, which, to be fair, when Databricks came around, they said that at HD Insight. So this is a different runtime. This is much closer to vanilla Spark. So if you went, I'm going to spin up a load of local little machines and install Spark on it by going to Apache Spark Foundation and downloading the latest cut of it, then that would be a very similar version of Spark that is installed currently inside Azure Synapse Workspaces. If you go on Databricks, you'll see a slightly different functionality. You see premium functionality. Essentially, they've taken Spark and built a load of extra stuff around it so they can charge a premium Databricks price. They are two different things. But we do have Spark inside here. It runs on a cluster. When you want to run it, you got to wait for your cluster to start. And so far, it's been like 3-4 minutes. It's been pretty quick. But you still have that wait time. It's provisioned. And then when your queries are finished, you can say, well, stay alive for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it happens to be. But you do have that. You got to worry about that. Okay, up at the top, we've got some familiar friends. We've got Data Factory. So orchestration in anywhere else in Azure, we use Azure Data Factory. And now this is going to be part of Azure Synapse Analytics. So if you go into this workspace, this one pane of glass for doing everything, it's got a version of Data Factory in there called Orchestrate or something like that. But if you look at it, it is just Data Factory. And it's a slightly different version. It doesn't have exact feature parity with the one that's live because this is in preview. And I'm assuming that they will just be the same thing. But currently, you can log inside Synapse Analytics and see orchestration and see some stuff, and log into live ADF, try and use it. And so we had like the management layer just went over recently because they're building stuff here to make it Synapse friendly. Now, I'm hoping that as soon as everything is live, they're the same product. It doesn't matter where you use it, or even it's just inside Synapse. But for now, slightly different. You also got ADF mapping data flows. Now, I've kind of put that in orchestration, but actually, it's another flavor of compute. So mapping data flows is a draggy-droppy, GUI-driven Spark engine, essentially. So like in the old days of SSIS, I can say, well, take some sources, combine these, do some aggregations, do a lookup, write it out to another source. And I can drag and drop and do all that. When I hit go, that runs on a Spark engine, which again has to be provisioned, will stay alive for a certain amount of time and gets charged for. So some different compute options, but that's kind of baked into the orchestrate layer, but it's kind of a fourth compute choice. And then finally, got storage down the bottom. Now, when we provision Synapse Analytics, you kind of pick a lake for it to sit on, and that is just an existing data lake store Gen 2. So it's blob storage with hierarchical namespace enabled, and that is exactly the same as it normally is. I just used a production one and it's all fine. It's just the ability to see it inside Synapse Analytics is the new previewy bit. We've got a metastore. So as I'm going through doing things in Hive, in Spark, or in SQL On Demand, I can save things. So I can say, well, actually, there's a load of Parquet, but I don't want people to have to go and find that in the lake each time. Just call that a dbo.table, and then people can select from it and go off to that Parquet. So I can have a metastore on top of my lake that describes also my different entities and objects, which is awesome. Plan obviously being that that works across languages. So it's not full parity yet, but I can create some Hive tables in Spark and then read them from SQL On Demand, and that's great. That means I can just switch between languages. Awesome. The workspace elements, so there's less kind of core bits here, more just what you get in the box that wraps all this stuff. You've got the studio. So there's a new dev environment. There's a whole place I can go to write notebooks with IntelliSense and write SQL scripts and hook them together and manage all my code base. I can use linked services from ADF, and just say, well, here's all the things that Synapse is linked to, and use that elsewhere. So it's kind of, again, just this one big wrapper around it with a bow on top. I've got monitoring, which, again, if you're from Data Factory land, will be very familiar to you. But it is a one-stop monitoring plane. And I've got a management place where I can go and tinker and say, well, this is the size of my Spark pool, how many Spark pools. This is what I've done in SQL On Demand recently. This is how big my Azure SQL Data Warehouse provision SQL pools is now. So lots of things all baked in one box. That, to me, is what Synapse Analytics is. And I wish they'd come out with just a super simple diagram saying, it's just these things, guys. But taking a while. Final thing I just wanted to hammer home is the different flavors that we've got in here. Actually, no, I want to hammer home the point that we're in preview. So provision SQL pools, aka SQL Data Warehouse, is the only bit here that is live, that you can use in production, that is supported, that has full SLAs behind it. Everything else. So the Data Factory version that's inside Synapse, the Lake integration inside Synapse, all of the SQL On Demand pools, the Synapse flavor of Spark, all of that stuff, that is in public preview and is currently growing and having functionality added and having bugs found and all of that stuff. So that's kind of the hardest question is, what's live, what's not? The thing that used to be called SQL Data Warehouse that's now been rebadged, that's live. Of course it had been around for ages. The rest of the stuff, aka Synapse Workspaces, that's not live yet, that's in public preview. Hopefully that helps clear those bits up. Another bit that I was going to go on to finally, those different compute options, those 4 compute. it's kind of tricky to say, well, which one should I use then? It's almost like too many different options. Like, which one of them do you actually pick to do your work? So I thought I'd give you a quick overview of just the 4 recapped, how they're charged, where you should use them. So, SQL Data Warehouse, aka provisioned SQL pools. I can't say that enough. That's billed by the hour. So if you say I want 6 compute nodes, and you run a query and then you turn it down to 2, you're going to get charged for 6 for that full hour, and then you'll go into the lowest. You get charged for the highest scale you had it within any given hour. So be careful about that, because if you're doing just small little bits of work, that can rack up costs really quickly. So SQL Data Warehouse is like that. It's full T-SQL. It's not full T-SQL. It's the PDW version flavor of T-SQL. So it's MPP T-SQL. So certain things don't work. Like you can't do a recursive CTAS. A recursive CTE. You can't do a CTE that inserts as part of a CTAS if you're doing an insert. There's certain restrictions on it, but also other extra bits of language, because we're dealing with SQL Data Warehouse. So you can do things like you have to know which distribution you're using. So when you create a table, should it be round robin distribution or has distributed, should it be replicated? And these are all terms that are very MPP related. So it is a slightly different flavor than the traditional SQL Server engine, and you need to be aware of that in some of the syntax that you're using. So generally what's it for? Huge data sets. If we're talking about our data sets in the size of terabytes, SQL Data Warehouse is really good at scaling and working with it at that kind of size. If we're talking about huge, deep fact tables with only a few amounts of joins, it's really good at that kind of thing. So big, hefty, good aggregations, SQL Data Warehouse will excel. And it's going to be a long time until I stop calling it SQL Data Warehouse rather than provision SQL pools, but we'll see. The other side are SQL on demand. As I said, it is billed per terabyte read. So it's an awkward balance of how much are you going to use it? If I write a query a day that does a couple of terabytes, that's going to be far cheaper than leaving a SQL Data Warehouse turned on all day just in case I happen to write a query. But if I run that same query every 10 minutes, that's going to blow my budget. So it's really got to be really careful, because it's just how much are you going to use it equates to which one should you use. So for me, it's kind of like experimentation, quick things, and ad hoc occasional workflows. SQL on demand, great, will end up being super, super cheap, really useful. Things that's touching a lot of data, if you're doing it a lot, you're going to rack up costs very quickly. So be a little careful which one you choose and which one you work for. Maybe start off with SQL on demand, and then when you've got a better idea of what your usage pattern looks like, you can say, we've just reached the point where we're now more expensive than just having a cluster. We'll switch over and we'll use a provisioned cluster. Kind of makes sense. So yeah, ad hoc, occasional access, lots of different things. That's kind of where I see it fitting in. Mapping data flows. So again, it's build data factory style, which is per execution of different activities, but also when you execute it, it has to spin up a Spark cluster. So when that Spark cluster is provisioned, you're paying for it. So you've got a cluster cost as well as your data factory poking things cost. And then that cluster has an uptime, so it'll finish the job, and then you give it a time to live. You can say, well, just shut down immediately, or stay alive for the next 15 minutes in case another job comes in, and then it can just execute immediately rather than having to start up again. But you're paying for that time while that cluster's turned on. And if you've got lots of things running occasionally, they might just chain up so you've got a cluster turned on permanently. And that's going to cost a lot of money. So you've got to be a little bit careful about how you're balancing that cluster uptime and the costs associated. So, what do you do? Finally, you've got Spark. And again, Spark is built in the same way as the mapping data flow clusters. It's a Spark cluster that has to be turned on. When you try and run your job, it'll take 3 or 4 minutes to turn it on. And you can set that cluster to stay turned on for an amount of time. When it's the last query run, and if it gets no more queries, it'll turn off. Again, same problem. Get lots of occasional queries, could just keep you uppy, keep that cluster alive, and that's going to cost you money. So it can run Scala, Python, C#, SQL R. Its language flexibility is a lot greater on the Spark side. Maybe a little bit more of a learning curve, because obviously you're having to write code. So if someone's just used to SQL, just used to the graphical interfaces, they're going to find it a little bit steep learning curve when they first start. But it's so powerful. If you're doing a dynamic workflow, I want to set out a set of tasks and run the same thing for every single different thing that happens. I can write very generic workflows in Spark and just apply that to a ton of stuff. It's very powerful. you want to do machine learning, then I'm probably going to do it in Spark just because it's quite a rich ecosystem. There's tons of open source stuff I can integrate and bring in as libraries. And if I'm going to work with anything really strange, like complex, gnarly, nested JSON data structures, or if I want to do computer vision and do some analysis on videos in real time, all that kind of stuff, I could do that in Spark. Can't really do that on the SQL side. So maybe there's use cases for them. So your graphical one, your business analyst, your guys who aren't that developer savvy, they're not software engineers, they're not even data engineers, they might want to use that so they can drag and drop and they can visualize their data flows. But then you've got a lot of people who are doing some data science at scale and they want to be writing Spark. And then there's a load of traditional SQL analysts and they want to use Management Studio and they want to write queries against a proper Kimball warehouse and all that kind of stuff. And they want to be over on the other side. Now, just the thing to be aware of is if you've got a Spark cluster turned on and you've got a SQL Data Warehouse turned on and people are writing SQL on demand, then they're 3 different cost bases and you're not getting economies across them. So you've got loads of flexibility, loads of choice, loads of options, but be a little bit careful between them because, again, you might end up paying 3 or 4 times to do one system. So everything's in one place, but with great power comes great ability to spend huge amounts of money. Alrighty, so that is my quick overview of what is Synapse Analytics and how it all fits together. I hope that is useful. Now, the first thing that I did was went and had a bit of a setup of my first 20 minutes of using Synapse. So you might want to find that video, that's going to be over there, one side, and that might be useful. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like the video, do appreciate it. And in the next case, I'll just catch you next time. So, cheers.